There is a color that topsoil turns when it's leaving, not the rich black of prairie soil sitting in a field where it belongs, not the chocolate brown of a plowed furrow in April. A different color entirely, the color of coffee with too much cream, the pale tan of subsoil mixed with the black that used to be on top of it, swirling together in the runoff that pours off a field during a hard rain and carries with it the thing that took 10,000 years to build. That color means the soil is going. Once it goes, it doesn't come back. Not in a man's lifetime, not in his grandson's lifetime. The prairie built an inch of topsoil every 500 years. A single rainstorm can take 6 inches in an afternoon. The math is the math. You can't outrun it. You can only decide whether to help it happen or try to stop it. In Hancock County, Illinois, the western edge of the state, where the land rolls down toward the Mississippi in long, gentle slopes that look flat until the rain starts running. Every farmer made that decision in the 1970s and 80s. Almost every farmer made the same one. They tiled. Drainage tile, plastic pipe, buried 3 to 4 feet deep in a grid pattern beneath the field surface, was the miracle technology of Midwestern row crop farming. The tile collected excess water from the soil profile and channeled it to a drainage ditch or a creek, removing the standing water that drowned corn roots and delayed planting in wet springs. A tiled field could be planted 2 weeks earlier than an untiled field. 2 weeks earlier meant the corn hit pollination in July instead of August, which meant 10 to 15 bushels more per acre, which meant $40 to $60 more per acre, which meant the $400 per acre cost of tiling paid for itself in 6 to 8 years. The economics were irresistible. Between 1970 and 1990, approximately 80% of the cropland in Hancock County was tiled. The tiling did what it was supposed to do. The fields drained faster. Planting started earlier. Yields went up. The wet spots that had plagued farmers for a century. The low areas where water pooled after every rain, where the corn drowned and the weeds thrived and the combine got stuck in October, dried out and became productive. The tile was invisible, buried underground, doing its work silently, turning every acre of the county into corn ground. The dealers who sold the tile and the contractors who installed it made fortunes. The farmers who bought it made more corn. Everybody was happy. Everybody except Lester Grabb. Lester farmed 360 acres in the northeast corner of the county. Land his family had owned since 1896, when his grandfather, August Grabb, had bought it from a land speculator who'd given up on farming the Clay Hills east of La Harpe. The land was productive but challenging. Rolling terrain with slopes of 3 to 8%, heavy clay subsoil, and a natural drainage pattern that funneled water from the upper fields through a series of draws and grass waterways into Grindstone Creek on the property's south boundary. The farm had wet spots. Every farm in Hancock County had wet spots. The low corners where the draws flattened out and the water pooled after rain. Maybe 15 acres total out of 360. Areas where the corn was stunted or absent, and where the combine left ruts that lasted until the following spring. The tile salesman who visited Lester in 1974, a man named Dwight Mosley from Carthage Drainage Systems, identified 280 acres of tileable ground on Lester's farm and quoted $112,000 for a complete system. Pattern tile on the flat ground, random tile in the draws, outlets to Grindstone Creek. Lester listened to Dwight's pitch the way he listened to everything. Arms crossed, leaning against the barn wall, his face showing the same expression, whether he was hearing good news or bad. The flat, patient look of a man who makes decisions slowly because he's learned that fast decisions are expensive. $112,000, Lester said. Financed over 15 years. Your payment is $940 a month. Your yield increase pays the payment in 6 years. After that, it's pure profit. What happens to the water? What do you mean? The water. The water that's in my fields right now. Where does it go when the tile takes it out? It goes to the ditch. The ditch goes to Grindstone Creek. The creek goes to the Lemoyne River. The Lemoyne goes to the Illinois. The Illinois goes to the Mississippi. Standard drainage. Same system every farm in the county uses. Right now, the water in my fields soaks into the ground. Slowly, over days. The soil absorbs it. The clay holds it. The grass waterways slow it down. The draws carry it to the creek over a week. After the tile, the water goes from my fields to the creek in how long? Hours. That's the point. The faster the water leaves, the sooner you plant. The faster the water leaves my fields, the faster it arrives at everybody else's. My fields are uphill from 2,000 acres of bottomland along Grindstone Creek. Right now, those bottomland farms get my runoff slow, over days. After the tile, they get it fast, in hours. And they get all of it at once, instead of spread out over a week. That's not your problem, Lester. That's a watershed management issue. It's a neighbor issue. The water from my fields ends up on Virgil Prather's bottomland. If I speed it up, I flood Virgil. If I slow it down, I protect him. The tile speeds it up. I'm not tiling. Dwight Mosley stared at Lester as if the farmer had just turned down a winning lottery ticket. He packed his briefcase, shook his head, and drove away. He told the story at the next drainage contractor meeting in Springfield, and the story spread the way contractor stories spread, to the dealers, to the bankers, to the other farmers, and eventually back to Hancock County, where it became the Lester Grabb story, the story about the farmer who wouldn't tile because he was worried about his neighbor's bottomland. The reaction was what you'd expect. Not anger, amusement. The quiet, steady amusement that farm communities direct at people who do things differently and can't quite explain why in terms that everyone else understands. Lester's reason, protecting Virgil Prather's bottomland, sounded noble but impractical, the kind of thing a man says when he doesn't want to admit he can't afford the tile. The co-op crowd had their interpretation, and the interpretation was money. Lester won't tile because he can't afford it. All that talk about water and neighbors is just cover. He's sitting on 15 acres of drowned ground because he's too cheap to spend $112,000 that would pay for itself in 6 years. Every farmer in the township has tiled except Lester Grabb and the Amish have a religious reason. Lester just has a stubbornness reason. The comparison to the Amish was the cruelest cut. In Hancock County, the Amish were respected but considered backward. Good people who chose to live without modern technology for reasons the English farmers couldn't relate to. Putting Lester in the same category was a way of saying that his decision wasn't principled. It was primitive. Lester heard the talk, couldn't avoid it. The co-op was the social center of farm country, and the co-op was where reputations were built and destroyed over coffee and biscuits. He never responded. He never defended the decision. He farmed his 360 acres the way his father had farmed them and his grandfather had farmed them. Corn and beans in rotation on the better ground, hay and pasture on the steeper slopes, grass waterways in every draw, the wet spots accepted as the cost of living on rolling land. He made less per acre than his tiled neighbors. He planted 2 weeks later. His yields were 15 to 20 bushels below the county average. The numbers proved what the co-op crowd believed. That Lester was leaving money in the ground 'cause he wouldn't put pipe in the ground. Now, let me tell you about what Lester saw that his neighbors didn't. Because the thing he saw wasn't in the field. It was in the creek. Grindstone Creek ran along the south edge of Lester's property for about a mile before turning south toward the Lemoyne River. Lester had been walking that creek since he was a boy, fishing for smallmouth bass in the summer, checking the water level in the spring, watching the way the creek handled rain. He knew every pool, every riffle, every bend where the water slowed, and every straight where it sped up. He knew the creek the way a doctor knows a patient, by observation over decades, by the accumulation of small details that add up to understanding. Before the tiling boom, Grindstone Creek ran muddy for a day after a heavy rain and then cleared. The water rose slowly, peaked gently, and dropped back over 3 to 5 days. The creek carried sediment. Every creek does. But the sediment load was moderate because the water arriving at the creek was slowed by the soil's absorption capacity and by the grass waterways and draws that acted as natural filters. The soil held the rain. The rain released slowly. The creek managed. After the tiling boom, Grindstone Creek changed. Lester watched it change and he kept notes. Not scientific data, just observations in a farm journal he'd been keeping since 1962. The entries tell the story. 1978. Creek came up 3 feet in 4 hours after the June rain. Never seen it come up that fast. Muddy as chocolate milk. Still muddy 2 days later. 1982. Bank caved on the south bend. 40 feet of bank went into the creek. Creek was running so hard from the tile outlets upstream that the current undercut the bank. Virgil lost about a 1/4 acre of bottom field into the water. 1985. Worst flooding I've seen on Grindstone. Creek came up 5 feet in 3 hours. Virgil's whole bottom field underwater. Standing. Corn in 2 feet of mud. He lost 30 acres. 1991. Counted 7 tile outlets dumping into Grindstone between my place and the county road. Each one pouring like a fire hose after the storm. The creek can't handle it. The water comes too fast. Before the tile, the rain soaked in and came out slow. Now it goes in the pipe and comes out all at once. Lester saw what the tile was doing. The tile was solving a problem on each individual farm. Wet spots, late planting, drowned corn, and creating a problem on the watershed. The water that used to be absorbed and released slowly by the soil was now being collected and dumped into the creek in hours instead of days. Every tiled farm was a fire hose pointed at Grindstone Creek. 280 farms in the Grindstone watershed, 80% tiled, each one draining faster than nature intended, all of them dumping into the same creek at the same time during every rain event. The creek was drowning, not from too much water. The total rainfall hadn't changed. From too much water too fast. The creek's capacity, its ability to carry water without flooding, was designed by nature for the slow release of rain through soil absorption. The tile had bypassed the soil. The water arrived at the creek at a rate the creek wasn't built for. The result was flooding, bank erosion, and the tan-colored runoff that meant topsoil was leaving, not from Lester's fields, which still absorbed and released slowly, but from the tiled fields upstream, where the concentrated tile outlet flows were cutting gullies in the ditches and carrying the black topsoil into the creek like a slow hemorrhage. Lester didn't tell anyone this. He wrote it in his journal. He watched the creek. He farmed his ground the old way, and he accepted the 15-bushel yield penalty, and he waited. Not for anything specific, not for a dramatic vindication, just waited. The way a man waits who believes that what he's doing is right, even when everyone around him thinks it's wrong. Sometimes the wait is rewarded, sometimes it isn't. Lester didn't know which it would be. He just knew that speeding water off his land to make more corn wasn't a trade he was willing to make. The wait ended on June 7th, 2008. Let me tell you about the storm, because it was the kind of rain event that separates the tiled landscape from the untiled landscape so dramatically that the difference is visible from the air. Between June 7th and June 9th, 2008, Hancock County received 11.4 inches of rain in 48 hours. Not a steady rain, a series of thunderstorm complexes that rolled across western Illinois in waves, each one dropping 2 to 3 inches in an hour before moving on and being replaced by the next. The soil, already saturated from a wet May, couldn't absorb any of it. On the tiled farms, the water went into the tile immediately. The system did what it was designed to do, draining the fields as fast as possible. On Lester's untiled farm, the water sat on the surface, pooled in the draws, and began the slow process of finding its way to the creek through the grass waterways that Lester had maintained since the 1960s. The tile outlets along Grindstone Creek opened like fire hydrants. Every tiled farm in the 12,000-acre watershed was dumping simultaneously. The creek rose. It rose faster than anyone had ever seen. 3 feet in the first hour, 5 feet in the second, 7 feet by the end of the first day. The creek, which normally ran 2 feet deep and 20 feet wide, was 8 feet deep and 100 feet wide by nightfall on June 7th. It had left its banks entirely, spreading across the bottomland that lined both sides, covering Virgil Prather's corn, covering the road, covering the low pastures, covering everything within reach with a sheet of brown water that was moving fast enough to carry hay bales and fence posts and the black topsoil from every tiled field in the watershed. By June 9th, the flooding had crested. Grindstone Creek had spread to 300 feet wide in places, wider than the creek had been since the flood of 1947, which old-timers considered the benchmark. But the 1947 flood had happened before the tiling boom, and the comparison revealed something that shocked the county. The 2008 storm was smaller than the 1947 storm. 1947 had dropped 13.2 inches. 2008 dropped 11.4 inches, nearly 2 inches less. But the 2008 flood was worse. Higher water, faster rise, wider spread, more damage. The same watershed, less rain, worse flood. The difference was the tile. The tile had accelerated the runoff to the point where a smaller rain event produced a larger flood, because all the water arrived at the creek simultaneously instead of being absorbed and released over days. The damage was measured in acres. 1,400 acres of bottomland along Grindstone Creek were flooded, standing corn destroyed, topsoil scoured, gullies cut across fields that had been flat the week before. The erosion was catastrophic on the slopes, above the bottomland. The concentrated flow from the tile outlets had cut channels in the ditches, 3 feet deep, 4 feet wide, carving paths through the topsoil and into the yellow clay subsoil beneath. The tan-colored runoff that Lester had been watching for decades was now a torrent, carrying the county's topsoil into Grindstone Creek, into the Lemoyne River, into the Illinois, into the Mississippi, and eventually into the Gulf of Mexico, where it would contribute to the dead zone that was already the size of New Jersey. Virgil Prather lost 80 acres of corn, not just the crop, the soil under the crop. The floodwater had scoured 3 to 4 inches of topsoil from Virgil's bottomland, depositing it downstream in sandbars and sediment plumes. 3 inches of topsoil. At the prairie's building rate of 1 inch per 500 years, that was 1,500 years of soil gone in 2 days. Virgil stood at the edge of his field after the water receded and looked at the exposed subsoil. Yellow clay, sterile, the color of something that's never grown anything and never will without decades of rebuilding. My grandfather broke this ground in 1908, Virgil told the county extension agent, who came to assess the damage. It had 18 inches of topsoil, black as coal. My father farmed it for 40 years, and it still had 16 inches. I've farmed it for 30 years, and now I'm looking at clay. The topsoil went into the creek. The creek took it to the river. The river took it to God knows where, and it's not coming back. Now let me tell you about Lester's farm, because the contrast between what happened on Lester's 360 acres and what happened on every tiled farm around him was so stark that the county soil conservationist drove out the following week, specifically to document it. The conservationist's name was Karen Whiteside. She'd been with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service in Hancock County for 12 years, and she'd spent most of those years trying to convince farmers to install conservation practices: grass waterways, buffer strips, terraces, cover crops. The erosion controls that reduced the damage from exactly the kind of storm that had just hit. Most farmers ignored her. The tile had given them confidence that their fields could handle any rain because the tile would drain it. Karen had been arguing against that confidence for a decade. The flood proved her right, but proving a conservationist right after the damage is done is like proving a doctor right after the patient is dead. The information is correct, but the timing is useless. Karen drove to Lester's farm on June 14th, 5 days after the flood crested. She expected to find damage. Every farm in the watershed had damage. She found something different. Lester's fields were wet. The draws had standing water in the low spots. The 15 acres of chronic wet ground were, predictably, underwater. But the fields themselves, the 280 acres of corn and soybean ground that would have been tiled if Lester had accepted Dwight Mosley's quote in 1974, were intact. The topsoil was there. The rows were there. The corn, planted 2 weeks late as always, was standing. Muddy, stressed, some of it leaning where the wind had pushed it, but standing. The soil surface between the rows was black, the same rich prairie black it had been before the storm. No gullies, no rills, No exposed subsoil, no tan-colored erosion scars. Karen walked the grass waterways, the grassed draws that Lester maintained instead of tiling. The waterways had carried water during the storm, heavy flow, deep enough to submerge the grass in places. But the grass had held the soil, the root systems, dense, fibrous, anchored in 6 inches of topsoil, had locked the soil in place while the water flowed over it. The waterways had done what waterways are designed to do: carry water without carrying soil. The water that left Lester's farm during the storm was clean, or as clean as floodwater can be. It carried no topsoil because the topsoil was held by grass roots, absorbed by untiled soil, slowed by the draws, and the clay, and the time it took for water to travel through earth instead of through a pipe. Karen stood at the boundary between Lester's farm and the farm to the west, a tiled farm that had lost visible topsoil on every slope. The contrast was a line in the ground. On the west side of the fence, gullied, scoured, the pale subsoil showing through where the concentrated tile outlet flow had cut channels. On the east side, Lester's side, black soil, intact rows, the grass waterway carrying the last of the standing water slowly toward the creek. "This is remarkable," Karen said. Lester stood beside her at the fence line, hands in his pockets, the flat expression unchanged. "This is what it always looked like after a rain, before the tile. Before the tile, every farm looked like this after a rain. Before the tile, the water had time. Time to soak in, time to spread out, time to get to the creek slow enough that the creek could handle it. The tile took the time out. The tile turned days into hours. The soil didn't change. The rain didn't change. The time changed. And when you take the time out of drainage, you take the control out of flooding. The creek gets everything at once instead of getting it in installments. Installments it can handle. Everything at once it can't." Karen documented Lester's farm in a case study for the NRCS. Photographs, soil samples, erosion measurements, the comparison to adjacent tiled farms. The numbers were stark. Lester's fields had lost an estimated 0.2 tons of soil per acre during the storm, within the USDA's tolerable soil loss rate of 5 tons per acre per year. The tiled farms surrounding him had lost an estimated 8 to 14 tons per acre, 2 to 3 times the tolerable rate in a single event. In one storm, Lester's neighbors had lost more soil than the USDA considers acceptable for an entire year. Lester had lost almost nothing. The difference wasn't luck. The difference wasn't terrain. Lester's land was the same rolling clay as everyone else's. The difference was the tile. The tile removed the soil's ability to absorb and slow the water. Lester's untiled ground retained that ability. The same rain fell on both sides of the fence line. One side held its soil, the other side lost it. Now let me tell you about the co-op, because the week after Karen Whiteside's visit to Lester's farm was the first time in 34 years that nobody at the co-op made a joke about Lester Grabb's wet fields. The flood damage reports were coming in. The crop insurance adjusters were in every field. The numbers were brutal. $2.8 million in crop damage across the Grindstone watershed. $1.4 million in estimated soil loss. The value of the topsoil that had washed into the creek, calculated at $600 per acre inch, based on the cost of replacing the organic matter, the nutrients, and the water-holding capacity that the topsoil provided. The infrastructure damage, washed-out culverts, eroded roads, damaged bridges, added another $800,000, $5 million in total damage from 11.4 inches of rain. On a landscape that had received 13.2 inches in 1947 and survived with a fraction of the damage. The difference was 40 years of tiling, 40 years of speeding water off the land, 40 years of treating water as a problem to be removed instead of a resource to be absorbed. The co-op crowd was quiet. The men who'd been making jokes about Lester's wet spots for 3 decades were looking at their own fields. The gullies, the exposed clay, the erosion scars that would take years to repair and decades to refill with topsoil. Some of them were looking at damage that would never be repaired in their lifetimes. Areas where the erosion had cut to the subsoil, and the subsoil was clay that wouldn't grow corn without years of organic matter building. Lester came into the co-op on Saturday morning the way he always did. He bought his coffee. He sat at the counter. He didn't say anything about the flood. He didn't say anything about his fields. He didn't say anything about the 34 years of jokes, or the $112,000 he hadn't spent, or the 15 wet acres he'd accepted as the cost of farming responsibly. He sat with his coffee and his flat expression, and he waited for someone else to say it first. Virgil Prather said it. Virgil, who had lost 80 acres of corn and 4 inches of topsoil. Virgil, whose bottomland had been flooded by the accumulated tile outlets of 280 upstream farms. Virgil, who had been on the receiving end of every tiled acre in the watershed for 30 years. "Lester," Virgil said from across the counter, "Karen Whiteside told me your fields didn't erode. She said your topsoil is still there. It's still there. Mine's not. I lost 4 inches on the bottom field, 60 years of my family's topsoil in the creek in 2 days." Virgil paused. "You tried to tell us. In '74, when Dwight was selling everybody on tile, you said it would speed the water up. You said it would flood the bottomland. You said the creek couldn't handle it. I said it to Dwight. I didn't say it to the county. Wasn't my place. It was your place. You were the only one who saw it. You were the only one who understood what the tile would do to the water. The rest of us looked at the yield increase and signed the check. You looked at the creek. I looked at the creek because my grandfather told me to. He said a farm is a piece of a watershed, not a piece of paper. What you do to your water, you do to your neighbor's water. The tile took my water and made it Virgil's water, faster than Virgil could handle it. I wasn't willing to do that for 15 bushels of corn." The co-op went silent. 12 men at the counter, all of them tiled, all of them damaged, all of them hearing a sentence that reframed 34 years of mockery. I wasn't willing to do that for 15 bushels of corn. Lester finished his coffee and left. He didn't stay for the silence. The silence was the co-op's business, not his. Now let me tell you about what came after, because the flood of 2008 didn't change Hancock County overnight. It changed it slowly, the way Lester's waterways changed the flow of the water, in time, not in force. Karen Whiteside's NRCS case study on Lester's farm was published in 2009. The case study documented the erosion differences between tiled and untiled land during the storm and recommended that farmers in the Grindstone watershed consider tile management, practices that slow the tile outlet flow, including controlled drainage structures, buffer strips at tile outlets, and the restoration of grass waterways that the tiling had eliminated. The tile management practices weren't removal. Nobody was going to dig up their tile. But they were an acknowledgement that the tile, unmanaged, had contributed to the flood damage. The same tile that increased corn yields by 15 bushels per acre had increased flood damage by $5 million in a single event. The cost-benefit math that had looked so clear in 1974, tile pays for itself in 6 years, didn't account for the cost that arrived all at once, 34 years later, when the accumulated drainage of 280 farms hit the creek at the same time. 7 farmers in the Grindstone watershed installed controlled drainage structures on their tile outlets between 2009 and 2012. The structures, adjustable risers, that hold water in the tile system instead of dumping it immediately, slowed the tile discharge by approximately 40% during rain events. The creek response was measurable. Peak flow rates during heavy rain dropped 15% in the monitored sections of Grindstone Creek. The flooding wasn't eliminated. The tile was still there, still draining, still faster than nature intended. But the controlled structures gave the system back some of the time that the tile had taken away. Lester didn't install anything. He didn't need to. His farm was already the controlled system. His soil absorbed rain. His waterways slowed runoff. His draws carried water to the creek over days instead of hours. His farm was what every farm in the watershed had been before 1970, a sponge that held rain and released it slowly, and what every tiled farm had stopped being the day the pipe went in the ground. The J.D. dealership connection in this story isn't a separate scene. It's woven through the whole narrative, because the dealer who sold the tile, Dwight Mosley's drainage company, was the same operation that sold the controlled drainage structures after the flood. The same company that had profited from installing the tile profited again from managing the damage the tile caused. Lester noted this with the dry humor of a man who'd been watching the business cycle of water for 40 years. First, they sell you the pipe to speed the water up. Then they sell you the riser to slow it down. Next, they'll sell you a way to put the water back in the ground where it was before they put the pipe in. The whole circle. And they get paid at every turn. Let me tell you about how this ends. Lester Grabb died in 2019 at 84. He'd farmed 360 acres for 56 years, never tiled, never drained his wet spots, never made the corn money that his neighbors made, and never lost the topsoil that his neighbors lost. His son Philip farms the ground now. Philip has not tiled. Philip maintains the grass waterways. Philip accepts the 15-acre wet spots as the cost of keeping his soil on his farm instead of sending it to the Gulf of Mexico. The Farmall 1066 that Lester used for heavy field work is in the barn. Philip uses it. The journal that Lester kept since 1962. The farm journal with creek observations going back 57 years. Is in Philip's office, on the shelf beside the NRCS case study that Karen Whiteside published in 2009. The journal and the case study tell the same story from different perspectives. Lester's in pencil, Karen's in data. Both say the same thing. The soil that stays on the farm is worth more than the corn that leaves it. Karen Whiteside retired from the NRCS in 2021. She tells the Grabb story at every conservation workshop she attends. She tells it as a story about one farmer who understood something that the entire county ignored for 34 years. The water management is not about removing water from the field. It's about managing when the water leaves. The tile removed it immediately. Lester's untiled ground released it slowly. The difference was time, and time was the only thing protecting the topsoil. Lester Grabb's farm is the only farm in the Grindstone watershed that has the same topsoil depth it had in 1968, Karen tells the workshops. Every other farm has lost 2 to 6 inches since tiling. That's 1,000 to 3,000 years of soil building, gone in 40 years of drainage. Lester's soil is still there because Lester's water still behaves the way water is supposed to behave, slowly. The tile made the water fast. Fast water carries soil. Slow water drops it. Lester chose slow, and slow saved his farm, while fast destroyed his neighbors. Virgil Prather retired in 2015. His bottomland has never fully recovered from the 2008 flood. The 4 inches of topsoil that washed away have been partially replaced by cover cropping and manure applications, but the organic matter is still below what it was before the flood. And the crop insurance adjuster still rates the field at 85% of its pre-flood productivity. The 1,500 years of soil building that the prairie invested in Virgil's bottomland are gone. Virgil will not see them replaced. His children will not see them replaced. His grandchildren might, if they farm the way Lester farmed, slowly, carefully, and with the understanding that soil is not a commodity that can be replaced by a trip to the dealer. Soil is time, and time once spent doesn't come back. The joke stopped in 2008. The topsoil didn't. That's the whole story. Subscribe to The Vintage Farmer for more. We'll see you in the next one.